I've always loved hiking. There's something freeing about walking deep into the wilderness, away from the noise and chaos of the world. Just you, the trees, the sky, and the earth under your feet. It's like stepping back in time, to a simpler place where nothing could touch you. I never expected that my love for hiking would lead me to the most terrifying experience of my life. It was late October, and my friends and I decided to take one last trip before the winter cold set in. There were 4 of us: Mike, Sarah, Jen, and me, Matt. We'd done this trip every year since college, finding some remote trail, camping for a few days, and just getting away from it all. This time, we'd chosen a trail that was more isolated than usual, a deep cut into the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. Hardly anyone knew about it, and that was the appeal. We arrived in the early afternoon, parking at the edge of the forest where the gravel road ended. The air was crisp, with the scent of pine and damp earth filling our lungs as we started on the trail. The forest around us was beautiful, untouched by human hands. It was peaceful, too peaceful in retrospect. We hiked for about 4 hours before deciding to set up camp near a small clearing. The sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows between the trees. It was picturesque, exactly what we had hoped for. We set up our tents, gathered some firewood, and soon had a fire crackling away. The orange glow felt comforting as night began to fall. That first night, we sat around the fire, talking and laughing, reminiscing about old times. Mike told his usual terrible ghost stories, and we all mocked him for how cheesy they were. By midnight, we were all tired from the day's hike and decided to call it a night. The fire died down, and one by one, we crawled into our tents. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the forest was deathly quiet. Too quiet. Normally, you could hear the rustling of leaves, the occasional chirp of crickets, or the distant cry of an owl. But there was nothing. Just silence, as if the whole world had paused. I felt a strange unease creep over me, but I brushed it off as the usual disorientation of waking up in the middle of the night. I was about to close my eyes again when I noticed something. Through the small mesh window of my tent, just beyond the flickering light of the dying fire, I saw eyes. Glowing, yellowish eyes staring out from the darkness of the forest. My heart skipped a beat. At first I thought it must be an animal, a deer or maybe a coyote. But the eyes didn't move. They were fixed on me, unblinking as if whatever was watching was aware of my gaze. I sat up, my heart pounding. I wanted to wake the others, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. It was just an animal, I told myself. But something about those eyes didn't sit right with me. They were too high off the ground, too steady, too human. I stared back at them for what felt like an eternity, and then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they blinked out. The next morning, I didn't mention the eyes. I convinced myself that it had been a trick of the light, or maybe I'd been half asleep. We packed up and continued hiking deeper into the forest. The day was uneventful, and by the time we set up camp again, I had almost forgotten about the eerie encounter. That night, however, the eyes returned. This time, there were more of them. As we sat around the fire after dinner, I noticed them in the distance, just beyond the trees, flickering between the branches. There must have been at least a dozen pairs of them, glowing in the darkness. I tried to ignore them, but they were impossible to dismiss. I nudged Mike, who was sitting next to me, and whispered, "Do you see that?" He turned to look, his face pale under the firelight. "What the hell?" Sarah and Jen noticed us staring and followed our gaze. The mood around the campfire shifted instantly. The laughter and conversation died, replaced by an oppressive silence. We all stared out into the trees, watching the glowing eyes that seemed to watch us back. "What are they?" Jen asked, her voice trembling. "Probably just animals," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe deer. Deer don't have eyes like that," Sarah muttered. We all knew she was right. These weren't animals. But none of us wanted to say what we were all thinking. There was something unnatural about those eyes, something wrong. We tried to carry on as normal, but it was no use. The eyes never left. Even after we retreated into our tents, I could feel them watching. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined those glowing orbs staring into my soul. The next morning, we all agreed to cut the trip short. The forest had changed. What had once been a beautiful, peaceful place now felt oppressive and hostile. We packed up our gear and began the long hike back to the car. But the forest wasn't done with us. The hike back should have taken about 5 hours. After 3, we realized something was wrong. The trail wasn't where it should have been. We had hiked this exact path just 2 days ago, but now it was as if the forest had shifted. Every turn led us deeper into the trees, and no matter how hard we tried to get our bearings, we couldn't find the way out. Panic set in. Mike pulled out his GPS, but the signal was weak, and it wasn't giving us a clear direction. The sun was starting to set, and the thought of being trapped in the forest at night sent shivers down my spine. "We're going in circles," Sarah said, her voice strained with fear. I didn't want to admit it, but she was right. We were lost. And the eyes were back. This time, they were closer. Much closer. They blinked in and out of view between the trees, following us, stalking us. No matter how fast we walked, they kept pace, never getting too close but never letting us out of their sight. By the time night fell, we were exhausted and scared out of our minds. We had no choice but to set up camp again. None of us wanted to, but we couldn't keep stumbling through the dark forest with no direction. That night was the worst. The eyes surrounded us, circling our camp like predators toying with their prey. They moved slowly and deliberately, and I could feel their gaze on me, even when I closed my eyes. It was as if they were waiting for something, biding their time. At some point, in the dead of night, I heard a sound. A low, guttural growl, followed by the snap of a branch. I shot up in my tent, my heart hammering in my chest. The others were already awake, staring out into the darkness. Then we saw it. A figure, tall and shadowy, moved between the trees. It was barely visible, just a darker shade of black against the night. But it was there, and it was coming closer. The eyes, the countless glowing eyes, were fixed on the figure, as if it commanded them. None of us spoke. We couldn't. We were frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The figure stopped just outside the reach of our campfire's dying light. For a long moment, it stood there, watching us. And then, it let out a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. A low, rasping laugh, like the creak of an old door, or the hiss of something long dead. And then it was gone. The eyes blinked out one by one, and the forest was silent once more. We didn't wait for the morning. As soon as the figure disappeared, we grabbed our gear and ran. We didn't care about the trail, didn't care where we were going, we just wanted to get away. By some miracle, we stumbled onto a road just before dawn. We flagged down a passing car and got out of there as fast as we could. I don't know what we saw in that forest. I don't think I ever want to know. But I do know one thing. There are places in this world that are not meant for us, places where the boundaries between the living and the dead blur, and where ancient things still linger in the shadows, waiting for those foolish enough to wander too deep. We were lucky to escape. But sometimes, late at night, I still see them, the eyes in the forest, watching, waiting.